So render layers. We're going to have a look at just setting up a couple of basic render layers for this shot. But before we do, let's have a quick test render just to see where we're at and get an idea of roughly where our render times are at as well, which will give us an idea for how long our sequence is going to take to render. So that's looking pretty good. Let's assume that something like this takes several minutes of frame, let's say. I'm going to guess about 4 or 5 minutes. So if we have 120 frames, then we're going to end up with sort of 600 minutes or so, which is going to be several hours, probably about 6 or 7 hours for the beauty. And for the volume, when we've separated that into a separate pass, it might be slightly less or slightly more, but roughly similar. So it could be that rendering this sequence might take up to 12 hours or so, depending on your setup, of course. So if you're running a quad core machine, maybe this will take a bit longer than that, or if you're running a Threadripper, then this might take less. So for me at the moment, I'm running a Ryzen machine with 16 cores, so that's pretty quick. So yeah, but you can reduce your render times if you go into your settings and you just reduce the sampling. So depending on what your setup is. So anyway, this is looking pretty good, and from here, let's set up a beauty render layer and a cloud render layer. So let's close this and have a look at our render layers. So to start off with, we've got this default layer, and the eye is just showing you which layer you're on or looking at. And this sort of little clapperboard is if you've got it on like this, that means that this render layer is enabled to render. So we don't want the render layer, the master layer, to render, so we'll turn this off here. And then let's create our beauty render layer. So click this here. Let's rename it beauty. And in the beauty layer, you have the ability to create a collection, and that's where you'll put your geometry. So let's call this geo. And let's create another one for lights. We won't add anything to that just yet. And then over here in our AOVs, we're going to create some overrides. So to create the one, you just right click on there on the tick, and we need to go into our beauty layer rather. Go into our beauty layer. You can't see any geometry in here yet because we haven't added any. So, but first we'll do the AOV. So right click on here, create absolute override for visible layer, and you can do that for each of the volume AOVs because we're not going to need those in the beauty. Whoops, locked it rather than creating an override. So you can either go in here and untick the enabled, but if you do it here, it'll work the same. So we've got overrides on these, so we won't get these being added to our AOVs in this render layer, which can, in this case, it probably won't impact the render time because there was no volumes in that layer anyway. But if you had, say, another layer and you had a whole bunch of cryptomats or whatever, they might impact your render time. So if you didn't want them in that layer, you just disable them. So that's taken care of those AOVs. And now, before we add the geometry, it's a good idea to have a look at our outliner and specifically have a look at sets. So a way we can control visibility of objects in the render layers is we can create mats, and an easiest way to do that is creating a set. So we've got the default sets here, the default light set for example. Let's create one for our geometry. So let's go into our master layer again, and let's grab our, well, first of all, actually we should unhide some of our things. So let's unhide the clouds. We're not going to create it, add that to a layer. Let's unhide it. So let's just unhide our trees as well, so we can see those. Now we want the tree standing, we want the trees instancer, and we're going to want the mountains to be in this set, because that's all of our geometry. So with those selected, go to create sets and just create a set, and let's rename that set geo. So that's going to be how we add. If we go into our beauty, if we go to our geo, let's add our geo by click and drag. So now it's brought that geometry into this render layer, so it's now visible. And the same goes for the lights. So if we can grab the light set, I'm just going to grab both the lights and drag those in. And you've actually got, if I make this a bit wider, you've got the option to click add as well rather than dragging them in. So now we've got the lights and we've got the geo and we've got the AOVs. One thing we're going to want to do, not in this layer, we won't need a matte in this layer, but we will in the next layer. So it's a good idea now to go into, because I'm using a stand-in. You may not be, if you're using geo, then you won't need to worry about this. But with a stand-in, if you're using a stand-in like me, if you open up the attribute editor, you're going to need to just go down. So we've got this, the file frame, etc., set up in the loading the AS file in. Close up the file contents, we don't need that, but we want the stand-in overrides. So if you haven't got that open, go to stand-in overrides, and you're going to just want to enable override matte so that we can override the material of the tree stand-in that's being instanced. It can be overridden with a matte material, because we're going to use that in a moment. So make sure you have that enabled. So let's close that again. So we've got things added in this layer that we want. Now's a good time to just make sure it's actually rendering correctly. So let's just see what our beauty layer renders like, and make sure everything is accounted for. So yeah, it's looking good. We've got everything we need. If we check our AOVs, we've got Z and we've got crypto. A note on the Z is that it's all white, but if you dial the exposure down up here to say -20, basically the data is there. It's just because the scale of the scene, you can't. It ends up sort of just looking washed out. So we will be able to use this in our comp. And then the crypto object, we've got just trees and the geometry. But let's say you had a lot more objects here, then you would have a whole bunch of different colors. But we've only got the one tree type and the one height field. So it's looking good. That is the beauty accounted for, and we'll have that rendering, so that's all set up. And then the next thing we want to do is create our cloud layer, so we can comp our clouds on top. So let's create another layer. Let's call that clouds, and let's create another collection, geo again, and create another one for VDBs, and one more for lighting. So let's create a lights layer. Let's add the lights to the lights layer. Add the VDBs, so the cloud VDBs, and also add the cloud instancer to that, and then the geo will be our geo set. Now here's the moment we're going to set up the override, because we want all of our geometry to render black and just be a matte. That way we'll get the intersections happening in between our clouds and our trees and so on. So open up the attribute editor for the geo set, and you can see there's an Arnold tab with an override tick here. We want to leave that on, and you have these override attributes. Now we need to add those. So let's add, type in AI, capital M, press enter, and you'll see AI matte comes up at the top. Add that, close that, and then for this layer, right click, create absolute override for visible layer, turn it on. So that will override all of our objects with an AI matte, so they'll render black. So that's set up, close that, and then additionally go into the render settings. We don't want cryptomatte in this layer, so let's create an absolute override here, and let's turn it off here because, oh no, wrong layer. we're working in the wrong layer. So yeah, that's something that you can, I should have noticed when I saw the volume passes are not enabled. So if we go to our, actually before we go back, let's make sure our matte isn't active in this layer. It's the wrong layer. So let's go to our geo, open up the attribute editor, let's turn that off for this layer, and let's have a look at our clouds layer. Here we are. So go back into your attribute editor for this layer, right click, create absolute override, turn it on. So that's on the correct layer now. And yeah, so we do have our volume enabled here by default. It was just turned off for the beauty, and we don't want the cryptomatte on this this layer. So let's create absolute override for this layer and just turn it off. So that'll just save a little bit of space. So close that. Time to see what our clouds look like. So let's make sure everything's working in this layer, our matte for example, and then if we're set up, then we can proceed with setting the renders. So yeah, we're seeing the matte. Let's just check, zoom in and see the trees. It does look like they're there. Check the alpha. Good. Yeah, the alpha's looking good. And we've got the passes that we want. Actually, we've already got volume Z, so we don't need the Z depth really. We'll just leave it. So the clouds are looking good. Let's close that. Let's just double check the beauty after my little gaff, just to make sure that everything's going to render correctly there. And then once we've checked these, we'll go ahead and render. So that's exciting. Okay, cool. That's looking good. Looks like we've got everything we need. Let's just check. Yep, got the passes we need. Good. Okay, well, now is a good time to save the scene. So let's save it. I'm going to save it version 4. And now we are going to go ahead and render the sequence. So to do this, I'm using my Indie at the moment, so I'm going to be going to the rendering tab. So I'm already in the rendering tab, but let's go there. And I'm going to be rendering this as a sequence. Now, if you were to have an Arnold license and you're using the full version of Maya, you can batch render. But as this is my Indie, I'm going to go to a render sequence, and that will bring up a little box. You have a bunch of camera options. We want our current camera. We want to enable all render enabled layers to render, and then that should be good to go. So then if you go ahead and click render sequence, so here it is, this will come up and it will start your render, and then you just need to let this run. And like I said, it might take a bit of time depending on your setup. So just if you want it to be faster, you could either hide the trees and do this without the trees, or render them separately, etc. Reduce the sampling. There's quite a few ways you can optimize the speed of this, but for the time being, let's go ahead and render this. And in the next lesson, we'll take the renders from this sequence and we'll comp them in Blackmagic Fusion.